Chapter 1. The night hit arrived without knocking. I was alone in the church that night. No candles lit, no choir humming, just me in the shadows breathing against the old stone walls. The wind outside scraped its fingers across the stained glass, and the heavy wooden doors loomed shut at the far end. That's when he was suddenly there, not walking in, not emerging from the sacristy. One heartbeat, the altar was empty. The next, a man stood there, tall, thin, robes blacker than the dark around him, and where his eyes should have been, only to hollow pits, deep and wet, like wells that had never seen light. My breath caught, but he smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't kindness, it was possession. "Good evening," he said, voice low and smooth. "I've been expecting you. I hadn't told anyone I was here." He stepped forward, the sound of his boots oddly muffled, like the wood was swallowing the noise. He didn't carry a Bible, yet his words had the weight of scripture. He spoke my name, then my mother's name, then a thing I'd done years ago. In a locked room, when no one could have seen, my skin went cold. I wanted to ask who he was, but my tongue felt heavy. He turned his head slightly. The hollows where his eyes should be seeming to draw in the canvas dark. "You've come for forgiveness," he said, "but forgiveness is not mine to give." He lifted a hand, fingers long and pale, and traced a cross in the air. The ear itself bent, and I swear the faint scent of burning hair reached my nose. "I am here to prepare you," he continued, "for what God will decide." The words ran inside my skull, echoing in places thought could not reach. My knees buckled, and I found myself kneeling without meaning to. He leaned closer, so close I could feel the chill radiating from him. "Your time is shorter than you believe." I blinked, and in that instant, he was gone. No footsteps, no movement. The altar was empty again, but behind me, the great door still stood closed, and in my ears, his voice whispered once more, "Mass has begun." Chapter 2. The Sermon That Named the Dead. The next Sunday, the church was full. Word of the strange new priest had spread through the village like a sickness whispered at wells, murmured over cooking fires. Some came out of faith, others came out of fear. I came because I couldn't stay away. He appeared the same way as before, I only blinked, and there he was at the altar, robes hanging like shadow-soaked cloth, the black hollows where his eyes should be drinking in the light. No greeting this time, no smile, just silence, thick enough to make the pews creak thunder shifting bodies. Then he began to speak. It wasn't scripture, not exactly. His voice was smooth, but there was something under it, a pulse, like a heartbeat in the words themselves. He spoke of sin, of debts unpaid, of graves that yawned before their time. Then he began to list names, one by one. At first, I thought he was naming the departed men and women buried years ago. But then the names changed. A man 3 pews ahead of me straightened when his wife's name was spoken. She Saturday beside him, alive and trembling. Then came the butcher, the seamstress, a boy no older than 12, all living, all staring at the altar with growing horror. I felt my stomach twist when my own name rolled from his lips. It sounded different and his voice heavier, older, like it had been spoken long before I was born. Someone stood to leave, but the doors refused to open. They rattled and shook, but no one could force them. The air grew warmer, the scent of iron curling through the room. "These are the ones," he said, "who will be called before the week is done." A woman sobbed. Someone cursed, and without raising his voice said, "Do not hide, it will not help." When he finished, there was no blessing, no hymn. He simply vanished, leaving the echo of his last words clinging to the rafters. The doors opened on their own, and the congregation spilled out into the cold, muttering, weeping, some refusing to look at each other. I stepped outside last, and as I crossed the threshold, a voice brushed my ear. His voice, "You should start putting your affairs in order." Chapter 3. The confession it forced out of me. I told myself I wouldn't go back. After the sermon that named the living among the dead, I swore I'd keep away from the church. But 3 nights later, I found myself walking through the fog, my feet moving as if called. The doors were open this time, though no light spilled from inside. He was waiting in the confessional, not seated where a priest should be, but standing in the center of the booth, robes brushing the floor, head tilted slightly like he'd been listening to my thoughts for days. Those eyeless hollows fixed on me, and I frowned at the threshold. "Come," he said, and my body obeyed before my mind could protest. The air in the booth was cold enough to make my breath visible. I expected him to ask me to speak my sins, but he didn't. He spoke them for me, one by one, every lie, every cruelty, every quiet act I'd buried deep enough to forget until now. His words weren't questions, they were memories, vivid and suffocating, and with each one I felt something inside me unravel. You stole, he whispered. You betrayed. You wished for death, and not for yourself. I wanted to deny it, to call him a liar, but my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. My chest ached as if each truth was pulling at the threads of my heart. God answered you, he murmured, but he has not yet decided. The wooden walls around us seemed to pulse, the grain shifting like muscles under skin. My knees hit the floor, my head bowed without command. I tried to pray, but the words twisted in my mouth, becoming something I didn't recognize. Then, he leaned closer, his breath colder than winter. Say it, he ordered. I didn't know what it was, but my lips began to move, a language older than anything I'd heard poured from me, syllables that tasted of iron and ash. When it ended, he smiled kindly, but as if a lock had turned somewhere far away. You're ready, he said, for what comes next. I stumbled from the confessional into the empty church. The pews were gone, the altar was bare, and when I turned back, the confessional was no longer there. Chapter 4, Eyes in the Chalice. The next mass was held at midnight. No bells rang, no candles lit the path. Yet the church was full drawn in by something none of us could name, or maybe by something that had already claimed us. I took a seat near the front, close enough to see him when he appeared. As always, there was no arrival, just the sudden fact of his presence. Standing at the altar like a shadow had solidified into flesh. He lifted the chalice. It was silver, polished, reflecting the dim moonlight from the high windows. He held it as if it were alive, and in that moment, I thought I saw it breathe. The sermon was short, only a few sentences about seeing the truth and drinking the clarity of God. His eyeless face tilted down to the cup, and he began to pour the wine. That's when I saw them, two pale shapes, swirling just beneath the surface of the dark liquid, perfectly round, glistening, rolling slowly as if searching. They were eyes, human eyes. They turned in unison and fixed on me. My throat closed. I wanted to look away, but their gaze pinned me to the pew. I could swear the chalice tilted toward me ever so slightly, as if offering itself. He smiled, the corners of his mouth pulling wider than they should. To see, he said, you must first be seen. He stepped to the edge of the altar and raised the cup to his lips. The eyes vanished beneath the surface as he drank, and the sound thick, wet echoed in the silent church. When he lowered the chalice, wine clung to his mouth like blood. He looked at Meth's empty sockets, somehow sharper than any eyes, and whispered, you'll drink next. The rest of the mass passed in a haze. No hymn, oh blessing, just the lingering taste of metal in my mouth, though I hadn't sipped a drop. When I left, the moonlight caught the reflection of the church doors, and for an instant, my own eyes were gone. Chapter 5, The Child Who Spoke His Words. 3 days passed before I saw him again, but it wasn't in the church. It was in the marketplace, under the pale morning sun, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the sour stench of rotting fruit. People moved about, speaking in low, hurried voices, still shaken by the midnight mass. That's when I noticed the boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 then. Barefoot, a mop of dark hair shadowing his face. He stood in the center of the market, completely still, as if waiting for someone to call his name. No one did. Then he began to speak. At first, I thought he was begging, but the words were too measured, too heavy, and horribly familiar. It was the exact sermon the eyeless priest had given during the last mass, word for word. Even the pauses, even the inflection. People stopped to listen, some frowning mid-step, others backed away. The boy's voice was not a boy's voice. It was deeper, older, resonating in a way that made the hairs along my arms lift. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't just hearing him. I was feeling the words pressing against my ribs from the inside. When he reached the part about seeing before being seen, his head turned slowly until his gaze landed on me. But it wasn't his gaze. In that instant, I knew those empty sockets from the altar were looking through the boy's eyes. My throat went dry. My legs wanted to run. but I stayed rooted to the cobblestones. The boy smiled. Evan, Romsmy, he says you are ready, the boy intoned, though his lips barely moved. And you will help make more of us? I opened my mouth to demand what he meant, but a gust of wind cut through the market, scattering dust and scraps of paper. When it passed, the boy was gone. No one had seen him leave. Yet, faint and unmistakable, the priest's voice whispered from somewhere behind me, Mass is not bound to walls. Chapter 6. The night the cross turned away. It was raining the night I returned to the church. Not a cleansing rain, but a cold, heavy downpour that seemed to weigh the air down. The wooden door stood open, though the hour was late. Inside, the candles burned low, their flames bending away from the altar as if something invisible was pushing them back. I took my seat near the font. Others Saturday scattered in the shadows, their faces pale and tense. We were all waiting for him, though none of us dared say his name. Then, without sound, he was there. The eyeless priest stood at the altar, his robes soaked despite the fact that not a drop of rain touched the floor around him. He began to speak it with words from scripture, but with phrases that made the air grow colder, sharper, as if the syllables themselves were blades. That's when it happened. The great wooden crucifix above the altar, polished oak, untouched for decades, shuddered. Slowly, impossibly, he turned on his chains until the carved Christ faced the wall. Back to the congregation, gasps broke out. One woman crossed herself, but her hand frowned halfway. Trembling, the priest paused his sermon and tilted his head toward the cross. Even heaven will not watch what comes next, he said softly, and I swear the words came from somewhere deeper than his throat. I felt something move behind me, a slow rustle, as though unseen figures were walking the aisles. The others seemed to feel it too, shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward the darkness in the corners of the church. The priest raised his hand, palm toward us, and the shadows deepened. My vision swam, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw the cross on the wall with its arms open wide to reach for me. When the sermon ended, the crucifix still faced away. No one moved until the priest was gone. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air smelled faintly of smoke, and when I glanced back at the church, I could have sworn the shadow of the cross on the wall was still reaching toward the door. Chapter 7. The woman who heard her soul cry. It happened during the third midnight mass. The air inside the church was so heavy it felt like breathing through water. The congregation Saturday in absolute silence, each of us staring at the altar as if afraid to blink. The priest appeared, as always, without arriving. This time, his robes trailed further than the floor should allow, folding into shadows that moved as though alive. He began speaking in a voice softer than usual, a voice that seemed to coil through the pews, slipping into our ears like smoke. That's when I noticed her, a woman I'd never seen before Saturday, rose ahead of me. She was trembling, her fingers clutching the edge of the pew. Her eyes were locked on the priest, wide and glassy. Then, without warning, she let out a sound, a sharp, gasping sob that didn't seem to come from her throat at all. It was different. It was thinner, higher, and far older than her voice could possibly be. The sound carried a depth of despair that made my own chest tighten. I realized with a shiver that it wasn't her body crying, it was her soul. Her sobs built into a low wail, echoing against the stone walls, and the priest did not stop speaking. He only slowed, letting his words thread through the sound as if weaving it into his sermon. The woman's head tilted back, her mouth open but no breath visible. Her eyes rolled upward until only the whites showed. Then, suddenly, silence. The priest smiled. Now, he said, she knows what waits. Two men helped her to her feet. She looked pale, smaller somehow, as if something essential had been stripped from her. When she passed me, her gaze met mine for a heartbeat, and I felt the weight of a sorrow I had never earned but somehow now carried. She was gone before the mass ended. The priest never spoke her name, but that night, lying in my bed, I heard her cry again in the dark, in my own head until the first light of morning broke. Chapter 8. The bell that rang from the graveyard. It was long past midnight when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a dream's deep, resonant toll of the church bell rolling through the dark. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't coming from the steeple. It was coming from the graveyard. I dressed quickly and stepped into the cold, moonlit air. The village was silent, doors shut tight. windows dark. Yet with each toll, I felt the vibration in my bones, pulling me toward the cemetery gates. They were already open. Mist drifted between the crooked stones, wrapping around the names of the dead. The bell rang again, closer this time, and I saw him, the priest, standing in the center of the graveyard, his robe stirring though there was no wind. In his hands, he held the bell rope, but there was no belfry. The rope simply vanished into the air above him. Around him, the dead were listening. I swear they were their figures slouched against gravestones, earth clinging to their limbs, eyes hollow but turned toward him. He was preaching, his voice rolling low, the words too distant to fully catch yet heavy enough to press against my skull. One of the corpses shifted, bones cracking, and I recognized the dress of the woman who uttered her soul cry during Mass. I stepped back, but the priest had turned. Though he had no eyes, I felt his gaze pierce through the fog. "You hear the sermon, too," he said, voice carrying effortlessly across the graves. "Come closer." I didn't move, couldn't. My legs were ice. He smiled faintly. "You will, in time." The bell rang once more. All at once, the dead turned their heads toward me. I stumbled back through the gates, my chest burning, until I was in the safety of the road. When I looked again, the graveyard was empty. The priest was gone. The gate stood closed, but the toll still echoed in my ears. Long after I returned home, 12 slow chimes, and on the last one, I could swear my own name rang in the air. Chapter 9. The book that wrote itself. The church was empty when I entered. No congregation, no choir, only the dim light of a single candle on the altar. At first, I thought the priest wasn't to read, but then I saw it. A book. It lay open at the center of the altar, its pages blank, its leather cover cracked with age. The candlelight flickered over it, and I realized the air around the book seemed thicker, as if it were breathing. I took a step closer. The pages began to move in a turning, but rippling, as though something beneath the paper was trying to get out. Then, the words began to appear. They didn't fade in like ink drying. They carved themselves into the parchment. The sound sharp and deliberate, as if invisible nails were etching every letter. I leaned forward, reading aloud without meaning to. It was a sermon, not one I had ever heard before. Yet somehow I knew it, and beside each paragraph was a name. Names I recognized. Names of people in the village, some still alive, others freshly buried. The last name on the page stopped my breath. It was mine. The ink beneath my name began to move, rearranging itself, and the letters twisted into a date. A date only 3 days away. "You shouldn't read ahead." His voice came from behind me. I turned, but the church was still empty. The book snapped shut on its own, and the candle went out, leaving me in the dark. I stumbled toward the door, but before I could touch it, the book's cover slammed open again. Pages flipping furiously, the scratching sound returned, faster this time, and in the faint light from the stained glass, I saw a fresh page. A read, "Do not try to run," and beneath it, my name again this time, written in something darker than ink. Chapter 10. The day he looked at me. I had always believed the priest couldn't look at anyone. No eyes, no gazimli, those black hollows that seemed to drink in light. But that day, I learned how wrong I was. The church was colder than usual, the air sharp enough to sting my lungs. The pews were nearly empty. Only a handful of villagers sat or scattered in the gloom, their heads bowed, as if they were trying to make themselves invisible. I kept my eyes low when he appeared. No sound, no warning, just there, at the altar, hands clasped. He began to speak, his voice calm and steady, the rhythm hypnotic. Then the words stopped. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Slowly, against my will, my head lifted. He was facing me, and though the sockets were as hollow as ever, I knew they were no longer empty. Something unseen pressed against me, pushing into me, until I felt a piercing, invasive weight deep inside my mind. The world around us blurred. The pews, the walls, even the air seemed to dissolve until there was nothing left but him and me. Images flooded my vision, not memories, not exactly. They were possibilities, moments of my life, twisted and bent. Me kneeling in the graveyard, me standing at the altar, preaching to an empty room, me without eyes. My body trembled. I tried to break away, but his voice low, almost tender, anchored me. I see you, he said, all of you, and you will see what I see when it's time. The pressure in my head snapped, and I gasped. The church was full again, people shifting uncomfortably in the pews as if nothing had happened. But my vision, it was wrong. In the reflection of the altar's silver cross, I saw my face staring back, and my eyes were gone. Chapter 11. The sermon that made the sky bleed. That day it happened. The air felt wrong, heavy, still, as if the entire village was holding its breath. Clouds had gathered since morning, low and swollen, pressing down on the rooftops like a hand. By the time we entered the church, the world outside had dimmed to a dull, unnatural gray. He was already there, no sudden appearance, this time just standing at the altar, motionless, as if he'd been carved from the same stone as the walls. His hollow sockets tilted upward, toward the stained glass windows. Though the light outside was fading fast, the sermon began softly, a rhythm, almost like a lullaby, laced with words that didn't belong to any scripture I knew. The syllables crawled into my bones, heavy and slow. The air grew thicker with each phrase, until the windows began to hum faintly. Then came the sound, a low groan, deep and wide as the horizon, rolled through the church. Outside, the clouds split not with lightning, but with a red glow that spread like fire under water. It began to rain, but it wasn't rain. Thick drops, dark and glistening, struck the glass with soft, wet thuds. The first drop slid down the window, and I saw the color clear like deep crimson. Blood. Someone screamed. Others clutched their rosaries, muttering prayers too fast to be understood. The priest never faltered. His voice only grew louder, stronger, as if drawing power from the horror above us. This is not punishment, he said, raising his arms. This is recognition. The blood fell harder, pounding against the roof, spilling in rivulets down the walls outside. I could smell iron and salt, sharp and metallic, seeping into the air we breathed. Then his voice dropped to a whisper, but I heard it as if he spoke directly into my ear. Soon, the sky will not be the only thing that bleeds. The blood rain slowed. The clouds closed again, hiding the glow. When it was over, no one moved. We just sat there, hearts pounding, waiting for him to vanish. But he didn't. He looked directly toward me, and though his sockets were still hollow, I felt the weight of his gaze. Chapter 12. The altar that swallowed him. It was the last mass anyone in the village would attend willingly. The church was darker than usual, though every candle burned. The shadows were longer, deeper, clinging to the corners like oil. The air was thick with the scent of old stone and something faintly sweet, like flowers left along on a grave. We waited. When he appeared, there was no movement, no sound. Only moment the altar was empty. The next, he was there. His robes trailed across the floor, pooling like black water at his feet. He began to preach, but his words were not aimed at us. His head was bowed toward the altar itself, speaking in a tongue I had never heard, harsh, jagged syllables that made the wood seem to groan. The surface of the altar shivered, then cracked. The sound was like bones breaking. The congregation gasped as the crack widened, splintering into a dark opening. From within, a wind rose in it, cold but damp, carrying the stench of earth long undisturbed. His voice grew louder, the shadows on the walls bending toward him. Then the altar moved. The great slab of wood tilted forward, impossibly, like a mouth opening. The darkness inside pulsed, almost alive. He stepped closer, one hand outstretched, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in him, just for a breath. Then he smiled. Without another word, he stepped into the opening. The shadows swallowed him whole, the robes vanishing into the void. The altar snapped shut with a thunderous crack that shook the walls. Silence. We stared, frowning, waiting for him to reappear. But he didn't. Not that night. Not the next. And yet, as we left, his voice came from somewhere deep inside the walls. Mass has not ended. I have not stepped inside the church since. But sometimes, when I pass by, I hear faint knocking from under the altar, and I know one day it will open again.
Epilogue. The new priest has my voice. Years passed before I returned to the village. The church stood exactly as I remembered, its stone walls darkened with age. The crucifix still turned toward the wall. The air smelled the same, damp wood, candle wax. and something faintly metallic that clung to the back of my tongue. I told myself I was only passing through, that I wouldn't step inside. But as I reached the doors, they opened on their own. The pews were full. Faces I didn't recognize turned toward me, eyes wide with the same unease I'd once felt. The altar was lit by dozens of candles, their flames bending inward, toward the figure standing in the center, the priest. Only, it wasn't him. Not the eyeless man I had known. This one wore the same black robes, but his head was bowed. I could not see his face. His voice. Though, his voice stopped me cold. It was mine. The cadence. The tone. The way each word carried weight, it was as if I were listening to a recording of my own speech, except threaded with something darker. Something that didn't belong to me. He lifted his head, and where his eyes should have been, there was nothing. The congregation turned to look at me, their movements perfectly in sync. The priest's lips curved into a slow smile, and he spoke directly to me. Mass has not ended. Something heavy settled in my chest. My throat tightened. And then, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, I heard myself answer, "I know." The doors slammed shut behind me.